Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Dean Marriott DiCristina, welcome to today's ComTalk. I'm Jody Luber, Associate Dean and Associate Professor of the Practice in Film and Television. Today's panel is called It's Our Time, Changing the Narrative of Latinx in Media. But before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Today's talk is being recorded and will be available later on our website at bu.edu/com and also on our YouTube channel. Also, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A instead of the chat, and those will be answered toward the end of our panel discussion. So, about today's panel, let me introduce you. But first, a thought. Whether you're watching the news, a film, or television show, we search for characters or people who look like us. That makes sense, right? But how often do people from the Latinx Hispanic community see themselves in these various types of media? How often are their stories actually told authentically? In 2021, US Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas called out the media and Hollywood to change the narrative of Latinx and Hispanics. The US Government Accountability Office's GAO report showed less representation of Latinos in front and behind the camera in major newsrooms, film, and television shows, despite the 2020 US Census showing that Latinos make up approximately 19% of the US population, 20%. So our panelists, who I will now introduce, will share their expertise and insights, provide tools for the media and marketing industry to do better, and advise Latinos looking to pursue a career in communications. Here we go. Please meet Johanna Calderon-Dakin. She's a publicist and Latinx culture consultant, and also a COM alum from the class of 2006. Johanna is a communications specialist with extensive experience in the entertainment and creative industries. She's developed and executed successful communication strategies for brands and institutions across the globe, including Airbnb, Amazon, the American Film Institute, Hola Mexico Film Festival, Latino Film Festival, Saatchi and Saatchi LA, and the San Sebastian International Film Festival. Johanna is a native of Mexico City and has played a crucial role for clients in developing and expanding their business and presence in the ever-growing US Latinx market. Her knowledge and understanding of the culture and language has been proven to play a key role in the ability of her clients to connect with this audience. Welcome, Johanna. Nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Lucia Rodriguez is Vice President of Cultural Insights and Marketing Strategy at Santiago Solutions Group, also known as SSG. She's also an alum from the class of 1997. She is a recognized subject matter expert with over 20 years of experience in multicultural marketing and cross-cultural communications. This enables her to effectively translate general market strategies into segment and in-culture marketing approaches in local and global markets. She effectively integrates marketing, communication, and sales efforts, creating synergy for maximum results for her clients. Listen to this client list: Comcast, NBC Universal, Claxon Cisneros TV, Stars Encore, Media One AT&T, Feeding America, St. Jude, USAA, and Eli Lilly, to name a few. Lucia has received numerous awards, including the Emma, ANA's Excellence in Multicultural Marketing, and she's a mentor and champion of diversity and inclusion initiatives. Welcome, Lucia. Nice to have you. You're welcome. Okay, next up, Yolanda Vasquez. She is the External Executive Affairs Director of the State's Attorney's Office for Howard County, Maryland, and she's also an alum from the class of 1992. Yolanda is an award-winning journalist with 2 decades of experience on camera and behind the scenes. She joined the Howard County State's Attorney's Office in 2019 and is responsible for developing a consistent communications plan to advance the office's mission both internally and externally, coordinating major community events, pitching stories to the media, and organizing speaking engagements for the state's attorney. Prior to joining the state's attorney's office, she was a general assignment reporter at Maryland Public Television and WJZ-TV in Baltimore. Previously, she was also a reporter in Kentucky, Texas, and Florida. Now, here are some fun facts about our friend Yolanda. She has interviewed everyone from Oprah to Bill Cosby, and while she was at BU, she placed 3rd in a nationwide stand-up open mic competition hosted by Jerry Seinfeld. She was also the only female and only Latina. Nice work. She's the recipient of 2 Emmys, several AP Awards, and a dozen Telly Awards. Welcome. And finally, our moderator, Efrain Hernandez Sanchez, is a recent COM graduate from the class of 2020. He's a freelance journalist and podcast producer from Cabos, Puerto Rico. He has worked in print, radio, and podcasting. His past credits include the Cambridge Chronicle, Latin News, WBUR, and BU's very own student-run radio station, WTBU. Most recently, he is a producer on The Sweaty Penguin, a podcast made in partnership with Peril and Promise, a PBS WNET public media initiative on climate change that tackles environmental issues with a nonpartisan approach. And as I said to him earlier before we came on the air, the founder of that wonderful podcast, Ethan Brown, was a student in my class, and I know it is an awesome, awesome podcast. So it is with great pleasure that I hand over the panel to Efrain to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jody. Thank you so much
Welcome.
for the incredible introduction. And thank you so much for everybody coming today. It's a pleasure. We're excited to have this great conversation. First thing I wanted to ask the panelists, since we're kind of talking about Latinos and Latinx and such, is just the term Latinidad. And I wanted to first kind of grapple with that and ask you first, like, what does it mean for you to be Latino, to be Latinx?
Anyone?
No, go ahead, Lucia.
No.
Well, I mean, I think Latinidad is a complicated term, just because even though, you know, we all come from different countries. We do have a lot of things in common, but there's a lot of also differences within our culture. It's a very rich culture. So like for me, for example, I identify more with being Mexican. It also, I think, has to do with the fact that I grew up, I was born and raised in Mexico City. But I do think that it is a powerful way to come together because we do share a lot of cultural commonalities. So, but it is complex. I think sometimes we would have this need to put all of us in one blanket, and it's not that simple. So,
Yeah, and I agree with that. And over the years, what I have realized is that I have my identity as Venezuelan and Hispanic, although it was a technical term a couple of decades ago, but now I think it's more commonly used. But I think that the Latino, it pertains to the US Latino identity, all of us together, regardless of country of origin, or if we were born in the United States or, you know, in another country. So it really, regardless of the differences, US Latino is an identity, and I identify with it. And at the same time, I'm Latin American, and I'm Venezuelan, and I'm Hispanic. But yeah, definitely Latino is my term of preference.
I think what being Latino means to me is an overwhelming sense of pride, mi orgullo, right? So for me, and that pride manifests itself in so many different ways, culturally, in traditions, food, recognizing people at an event, knowing, you know, mi gente, I have my family there, fond memories of time spent with mi abuela in Puerto Rico. I was born in Rio Piedras, and I grew up in Miami, and then I traveled all over. And so everywhere I went, I was always looking for, like, where are my people? ¿Dónde está? Where are you? Help me find you. But music, right? Music is what being Latino. Reading books, I happen to bring one of my favorites. This is When I Was Puerto Rican by Esmeralda Santiago. I love that. And this one by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Love in the Time of Cholera, right? So when I read these books, whether they're fiction, nonfiction, historical, they begin to give an overwhelming sense of pride. I love when I also see Latinos reflected on the world stage. So when I see Jose Andres, who's a chef and humanitarian, he's going to these battered islands and feeding people and doing the things that most of us would like to be able to do, that gives me an overwhelming sense of pride. Or Sonia Sotomayor, who's a US Associate Justice on the US Supreme Court, when she is reading her decisions and cases. Those are the kinds of things. And of course, participating with my esteemed panelists, I had to give a plug to you guys. This also is an opportunity for a sense of pride, and it lets me know this is what being Latino is really all about.
Sure, and I also wanted to recognize that when I kind of asked this question, the first thing that you all answered was, rather than, you know, going into deep into like what Latinidad means to you, is the first thing you said was like, oh, I'm actually from Mexico City, or I'm actually from all these other places. And I think something that is really interesting about Latino, as you know, Lucia, you've kind of mentioned, is that the term Latino is a very sort of specific kind of word, in the sense that it's for people who come from Latin America who are in the US, a different to other sort of words that are used to kind of put people in labels. It's a very specific kind of thing. And we have, you know, grapple with this, with Latino, but other words that have been used to describe us are, you know, Hispanic, which Lucia, you mentioned. And the newer one, the one that's kind of been sort of, you know, used more often nowadays, is Latinx. And I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on these words that are kind of used to describe us, just to get a kind of historical kind of way on how these words kind of came to be. Hispanic sort of became the word that was used in the 70s by the Census, as they were kind of, you know, taking data on this new kind of like Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, people from Central and South America who were kind of coming into the US, and they needed a word to call these people who are coming from Spanish-speaking countries. And Hispanic kind of became the term. 90s come around and there's a bit of, you know, friction with the word, just because Hispanic has a very strong connotation with Spain. And, you know, speaking from, you know, personal experience, I don't really think about Spain that often. Yeah. So it's what Latino kind of became the word of preference for some, just because Latino kind of has that word of it's ours, like it's a culture that we made, and Latino kind of fit that mold. But the difference with Latino and Hispanic is that Hispanic is a very gender neutral word. Latino and Latina are words that, you know, refer to people who identify as a man or a woman. So then Latinx kind of became a word to sort of cover a gender neutral spectrum of people who are in that Latinidad sort of aspect. It sort of became prevalent following, you know, the events of the 2016 Pulse Orlando shooting, while they were having the Latin night, and sort of to describe the people who, you know, died that night, who didn't particularly adhere to the binary and gender norms. So I kind of wanted to kind of talk to you about these terms, because also Latinx is sort of a word that is new. Not a lot of people who I know use in that sense. But yeah, I just want to get your thoughts about these words and how just the differences in them and the nuances of them.
I can go first. For me, I'm a marketer and a communicator, so I always have this perspective, you know, of the term from, you know, a technical perspective, and that's how I see it. However, the same way that happened with Hispanic, that was more of a technical term, I think that Latinx is going to be embraced and is going to start being used more, especially by the younger generations, and that are, you know, more multicultural and more diverse and more inclusive in their approaches. So I think that's going to happen. However, I saw a recent study from Pew Research, and only 23% of people that identify as Latino or Hispanic knew the word, and only 3% of Latinos in that same study used the actual term. I mean, they identify as Latinx. So I see it in the early stages, and definitely is gender neutral. So I think I'm not against it, but it will take time until it is widely used. And for now, for me, it's more of a technical term.
And I think now even they have started to use Latine instead of Latinx, because I think Latinx was more like an Anglo kind of way of working with the language. So, I mean, I think it's, if, you know, it is, if you want to identify as Latine, Latinx, everybody has that, right? And if it makes people feel more inclusive in that, I think why not, right? I mean.
I'm very old school. I mean, you pulled it right out the hat. Efrain, you said 70s, so there we go. Latinos and Hispanics is pretty much what I grew up. That was the term that was used. And truthfully, I remember having conversations with people about, were those terms interchangeable, or was one more preferable or better than the other? right? So for the longest, you kept saying, should I say Latinos or should I say Hispanics? Are you offended if I say one or the other? And there was a whole long conversation that I would have with my majority, my non-Latinos, about this. And frankly, I think at the time I didn't know the answer. I think it was just whatever I personally was comfortable with. So when I first heard the term Latinx, it was in reference to the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, is what I remember. And I'll be honest, I was very confused because I thought the reason they were saying Latinx was because it was specifically being used by non-binary Latinos who didn't want to associate with the O or A ending. So, and some people were saying that this was more inclusive of all genders. So I never could get the hang of it, to be honest. And I saw the Pew Research study that Lucia referenced, and that is true. And another survey of Hispanic and Latino Americans have found that most prefer the term Hispanic and Latinos to describe themselves, and only 2 to 3% use Latinx. But I think it's a generational thing, as Lucia mentioned. I think it's how, you know, your community, your tribe, who you hang with, who you're, you know, with. And I'm open to any and all, you know, because I've heard worse terms referred to me in the past. So I'll take any of those. But yeah, Latinx, I think, is something for me personally, it's going to take a little while longer to get used to.
For sure. I actually have a question here from Daniela Rebellon. She says, why can't we just say Latin instead of Latinx as a gender neutral term? And I think it's a very interesting thing because using the word Latin, and I think in Yolanda, you kind of mentioned this Latina, these words. Latinx is a very, it comes out the tongue easier when you're speaking in English. But if you were to speak in Spanish, Latinx, as you're kind of trying to have a conversation, it's not as fluid as it you should come out. And Latina is the word that I've kind of seen prevalence. But again, I think it is also a generational thing. Latinx kind of coming up, and people, and as we kind of become more understanding and more inclusive in our languages, we kind of make these terms to include people who don't prefer any other term. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think of Latin instead of Latinx or Latino?
I mean, I've thought about that, and I'm saying, like, Latinos is Spanish, you know, like, why can't, if you're using English, use Latin? I mean, English is a more gender conforming language. Spanish is, everything has, you know, the table has a gender in that. So it is a more complex language in that sense. So yeah, I mean, that could also work. I mean,
but I have a different perspective there, because Latin is not only the language, but it's also broader, because any of the countries that have a language that come from Latin are Latin, and that includes France, Spain,
European.
Italy. So all of those are Latin languages, and Spanish. So that's why, how do you differentiate that? So that's how I have understood Latino to be very specific to the United States.
For sure, yes. And it's also just to kind of go over this again. These are a conversation that is particular to the United States. Like, this is not a conversation that is being had in every Spanish country. I mean, the Spanish countries are also kind of tackling their ways of how to morph their language to all these other people. But you know, these are the reason we're in this sort of conundrum is because we are in the United States, and we have to kind of grapple.
Right.
For sure. So now that we've kind of gone over the words and kind of the lexicon of these words, I'll keep using Latino more because it'll, you know, roll off the tongue faster, and it's also because that's the word that I use personally to refer to myself. But know that I support the usage of the word Latinx. I think it's perfectly fine, and I think, you know, people deserve it. Oh, actually, we have a question from Carl Kravitz. Having spent 35 years in Latino marketing, I find Latinx jarring when I see it used in advertisers. It feels like a word that is being imposed on us by the general market and was not born out of the community itself. I think that marketers are getting ahead of themselves. How do you all feel about this? I personally have thought about that. I think it's a particular situation that we as Latinos find ourselves. It's just a thing when it comes to like even the language itself, right? Spanish is something that has been imposed on us for generations past, and a lot of the ways we kind of think about and how we consider ourselves has always been sort of dictated by others. And that is a word that Latinx has been kind of sometimes feels that way. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I mean, yeah, I think it was like the anglicized solution for that issue. So so that also is complicated, you know, and now it's like it's also like Hispanic Heritage Month, like something. It's great, but at the also time I have my issues because it's like, is it brands using us? Because then after the September, October month, you're gone, you know, like, are they really doing it because of the good of the community, or is it just because of it's good marketing and good branding for a while? So it's complicated.
Yeah.
Can anybody answer why we get half months? I'm sorry, Lucy, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
I know the history of how it started, but I just don't understand the half months. I think that's a little confusing to folks. But anyway, Lucia, go ahead and answer.
Oh, no, I was going to say that I tend not to use Latinx. Still, what I have seen the most, and I'm okay with doing that, is say Hispanic/Latinx, because there is an inclusivity aspect to it. So it sends that message of inclusivity. So I don't think the intention is to confuse or just start using a new term. I mean, from that perspective of being inclusive and gender neutral, I think my solution is that I do Hispanic/Latinx neutral.
Sure. Yes. And also I think it's a thing of nobody's making you use the word Latinx. If you don't if you don't want to use Latinx, then that's your prerogative. But I think it's a powerful word for those that don't identify as Latino or Latina. And I think the option of the word merits its actual existence. And I think that's an important part of it. So thank you for the question. I want to get into, now that we're out of that, I want to get into sort of your personal experiences when it comes as being people, professionals in the spheres of where you're all kind of located in as Latino themselves. And I want to get into this because we've sort of seen this reckoning of representation and how representation matters on the camera, if we're talking about movies, behind it as well, in newsrooms, how there's a lack of Latinos, and the stories that are being covered are affected by that lack of perspective. And I want to get to your sort of personal experience when it comes to that. Have you ever felt the need for Latino points of views or input just become incredibly apparent? Have you done anything to kind of deal with that? How do you deal with these situations in your personal kind of professional lives?
I mean, I have most of my professional career I spent in LA, which is has a very, very large Latino population. So, I mean, I've really also I think it has been very important to sometimes with my clients or people that I work with to be aware that you also have that big market, because I think sometimes they don't realize how important a market it is. And if you tap into that market, you can really make a big difference. So just being aware of that subtleties. And then also, like sometimes you see those stereotypes that I would steer away, because that's not really what Latinos are, this idea that a lot of people have, and you see it on TV, and now it's changing a little bit, but I think we still have a long way to go, that everybody, like Latinos are always the maids or the gardeners, and we're so much more than that, especially, people that are second, third generation in this country, so that people have to be aware of that, and not like I sometimes have felt that they sort of don't give credit to Latinos as consumers, and it's a very, very powerful market. So I think that's something that companies and in entertainment or any other companies need to be aware that is a big market that they should really tap into.
In my 25-year broadcast journalism career, I was always the token Latina in the room, voicing my opinion whenever stories came about in the newsroom. And typically they were regarding immigration and crime, right? Those were at the forefront. And the way the stories would be framed sometimes would cast Latinos clearly in a negative light. They assumed that we were always doing something wrong, or we were guilty from the get-go. They assumed that we were all here illegally, just assumed the worst about us. And I would speak up and I would say, listen, this story gets as much attention as all the other stories, and it should be vetted and investigated and written and reported like all the others. And so the tool I had at the time was my mouth and my persuasive manner. I mean, I was definitely the rebel in the room almost always. And it was not a popular thing to do. And believe me, I was chided for it, for speaking up quite frequently, but I just couldn't allow for them to misrepresent us as a people. And it was very important. And of course I would get flack for it, saying, you were hired to fill a quota, or you were finally, you looked majority enough for them to hire you. So your opinion doesn't count. There was a lot of that. And I do the same thing now in my current job. I'm the only Hispanic in my office in an executive position. And so my perspective on Hispanic culture and how defendants, which we have many that come through our office, how they should be treated and portrayed is critical in this space. And so my tool has always been my voice, and to be able to speak up for those who could not speak up for themselves.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that. And in my case, my first job in the United States was to develop the Hispanic marketing function at a cable company. So when I think about the question, professionally, I have always been in a position that it has been necessary to educate those around me about the reality of the Hispanic segment, or if you want to see it as a market, or the culture. And you do that with research, with numbers, but also, from your experience and your understanding. And it hasn't stopped that need to educate others the same way that we also need to learn about other cultures and other races and ethnicities. So I think it goes both ways, and both at a personal and a professional level. The tool that I have used is education, and not in an imposing way, but more from the perspective of sharing and aligning on a reality and changing a point of view, a mindset that is not aligned with the reality.
For sure, yes. And I like that you touched on the point of education. And I think sometimes it's a very interesting thing, because it sometimes falls on us, people who are just trying to, just do my 9 to 5 easily, not trying to do anything. It falls on us to do the education ourselves. We have to actually teach, these people that, no, it's not that like we're all like, this person that can't speak the language, for example, this person that doesn't speak English proper or like as well as you. It's not that, he's, because there's also something that I think is very interesting when it comes to us, is that sometimes we forget that just because somebody doesn't know the language or English properly, we kind of put them in this sort of sector of like, oh, they're not that bright, or they don't. And I think it's very important, and I think it's very important to kind of acknowledge that, just because you don't speak the language, it doesn't mean that you're not bright. It's just you're having a hard time communicating. But it's to go back to the education point, it's just, it falls on us as just employees, people that are just about the same, trying to teach other people that, no, the stuff that you're saying is not well, or the stuff that you're saying is not okay. And I think sometimes it's just very exhausting just to have to teach and re-educate and do this sort of kind of familiarization, when it really isn't. It's not on our hands. Like, just because we exist doesn't mean we need to be teaching you about the things that you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely a thing where it's something that, education is something that, you should be doing just continually as you grow up and as you kind of, do your life and such.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking that, I mean, I think, it's part of life, and that because also within the Latino community, there's a lot of issues that we also have, because if you see Univision, Telemundo, you see most of the people that are the anchors or in the telenovelas, they tend to be blue-eyed, white, and is that really what Mexico looks like? 90% of the population doesn't look like that, or if you go to Puerto Rico, so we also have to be sort of attentive within our own community of keeping us accountable of the stories that we tell, what we are portraying, because that's not really what Latinos are, we're so much more. There's like Afro-Latinos, Indigenous. And so that's also that within our community, we have people educating us, and it's just, and sometimes, yes, it is exhausting, but I think it's the only way to be better, to become better.
Listen, I'm going to give a shout out to another BU alum. Her name is Dolly Romero. And Dolly worked on Dora the Explorer. And to your point, Johanna, when Dora first came out, she was in LA at the time working for Nickelodeon, and Dora was blonde. Dora had blue-green eyes, and Dora was a pale complexion. And she's Mexicana, and she said, look, that's not what we look like. You can't put that out there to the population, to the public. And she fought a very hard battle to get Dora to have brown eyes, darker hair, and a darker complexion. She was also the one who came up with the idea of adding in a little Spanglish, and they said it would never work. It would never fly. And she fought vigorously to make sure that they included that as well. But to your point, what we tend to see on television sometimes doesn't always accurately reflect the full measure of our population or our culture.
Yeah.
Yes,
Totally.
100%. I just want to remind you, all the people who are kind of watching the attendees here, we have a Q&A option. Please, if you have any questions that you want to ask me or the panelists, feel free to ask them. The thing I wanted to mention about just this bilingual aspect, because I was just reading on Twitter about, people who identify as Latino, people who are generational Latinos who don't speak Spanish, and who find and that as generations kind of grow, and as the Hispanic population, Latino population in the U.S. grows, the people who know Spanish are becoming less, and Latino just doesn't become like, Spanish, you are Latino. And it's a thing where like there's a sort of personal even turmoil when it comes to that, right? It's the ni de aquí ni de allá kind of position where it's like you're not from, like, for example, just to give you an example, the diaspora in like the Bronx or Queens of Puerto Ricans who have to suddenly become twice as Puerto Rican when they come to Puerto Rico visit their parents and their families, and have to be twice as American in the Bronx, or else they're thought of less than, sort of thing. And it's a thing of like, there are people, Latinos, who are sort of fighting this thing of like, yeah, I'm Latino, but where do I find myself in this kind of sphere? It's just an interesting thing to kind of think about, because bilingual, like Spanglish is a very, it's a thing that I guess gonna go back to the language itself, but Spanglish is an important way of languaging, and people think that just because you speak Spanglish, it's like, oh, you just don't speak English or Spanish properly. And I think that is completely wrong. I think Spanglish proves that not only can you speak Spanish and English well enough, you can speak it well enough to mix it and intermingle it and make it make sense in like a grammatical sense of the sentence. Like somebody who's adding just gibberish into like English words to your Spanish sentence, like that is not Spanglish. Spanglish is a beautiful kind of coexistence of cultures and of languages. Like just because you put abuela in a sentence does not make you, fluent in Spanish.
Yeah. Very interesting points. I wanted to, you touch on bilingualism and biculturalism, which is present in the United States, and the Latino community or Hispanic segment has not remained static, right? So it has evolved. And as part of the work that I that I did for Comcast years ago, it was research on understanding that, because it was observed that the Spanish language portion of the Hispanic market was decreasing. So who was that majority within the Hispanic segment that we could go after? What were the products that we needed to develop for that? So that was the bicultural, bilingual approach that was introduced, I would say probably 6 years ago. And it was very successful. And it finally shed light in the new Hispanic market, if you want to call it that way, in the United States. And that reality that you are, some other company called it the 200%ers, because you're 100%er from one place, but you're 100% from here too. So how is that possible? I mean, 200% is not, it doesn't make sense mathematically, but that's how it is inside Latin people. I mean, you feel from both places, and communications and products and everything else has to respond to that reality as well. So that was interesting that you brought that up. There are case studies developed around that reality in the United States.
No, for sure. Yeah. And I think you've also touched on, the biculturalism that we have when it comes to, we sort of think of, and this is something that I think the US is sort of having a reckoning with, and we've kind of touched upon this, we talk about, of Latinos are not a stagnant one piece fits everybody. We all have our own experiences. We all come from different countries, different areas, different experiences and such. And I think it's just very important to kind of also remember that, Latinos themselves can be of any sort of race. You see your white Latinos, you have Black Latinos, Indigenous Latinos, Asian Latinos, people that, have parents that come from Asia and are born into the culture, and I've absorbed the culture in them. Latino it's a very fluid word, and it's not something that we can just be like, this person is Latino, so they must believe in so-and-so, and they must believe in this. And I think the US is sort of having this reckoning of not thinking of Latinos as this thing that is just the same for everybody.
And I think also generations changes, the more that they're lived here, it's a different kind of Latinos, not like us or like me in particular, that I came here. And that doesn't make them any less Latinos, it's a different evolving culture too.
Yeah, and also thinking about that reckoning that you're making a reference now, this issue and topic about colorism is so current and so important, so relevant. It is about that too, is that spectrum within the Latino segment that is so diverse, and we have all the skin colors so is how can it be that that's not represented equally, right? And so it gives me great interest and great thought in devising how can we impact a change there and generate representation within the Hispanic segment, the same way that we talk about representation for all races and ethnicities in the United States. So I think it's something that is very new and fresh, still the discussion, but definitely the same way that you, Yolanda, with your voice, and I said education, and Johanna, your understanding, and that we have brought change in that area that has to happen too. But I don't think I can pinpoint the answers yet. I don't know if the other panelists have insights on that.
For sure.
Sorry. I think it's complicated, but I think also those of us that are in the industry, using our voice and our opinions and giving them our feedback is important, but then also as consumers, right? I mean, we have a lot of power as consumers and choosing what you want to see and showing. It's like the UCLA study from Dr. Ana Cristina Ramon that showed that diverse households choose to watch diverse shows, and by watching those shows, you're telling the studios, put your money here because this is what we're going to watch and this is what we want. So I think that's also important, you know, to just sort of as consumers have more input in what we choose to watch and support those programs that we think represent us better.
For sure. Yes. It's definitely something that we ourselves have to reckon with because it's something that's been ingrained in just how we grow up. I mean, I remember, you know, like my grandma, how she's, you know, when my dad, who was, you know, darker skinned than my mom, and when my dad showed up with my grandma, he's like, ah, negrito, que bonito.
Yeah.
And it's always a thing where it's like, it feels wrong, right? Like I know my grandma loves me, but sometimes, you know, it just kind of feels wrong. But yes, so a question from the audience: are there Latina figures in media or entertainment that the public fans look to as a symbol of what it means to be Latina that you think is helpful or hurtful to the culture? I can't really think of a particular one that I personally think of, but I do think that a lot of the preconceived notions of what it means to be somebody from Latino, of somebody who is Latino kind of come from these kind of public medias, and they become big. The way they kind of, you know, make it big is by conforming to already establishing notions of sort of like, this is what I'm expected to be, so I will become it, and then they kind of do it. I haven't seen somebody who's actively breaking the mold, or at least, you know, personally. But I think I don't know. I kind of don't want to disparage any Latino person because just having somebody there is great for me.
I think that anything that is falls more under the stereotype is detrimental. But that applies not only to Latinos. I mean, that applies to everything. And I think that's not, that perpetuates, you know, that stereotype and certain perceptions. So I will say that will be my qualifier.
I mean, I do think, I mean, just in the question regarding how to get more Latinos in front of the camera and behind the camera, like Edward James almost, I work with his Youth Cinema Project organization. And basically what they're doing is in California, underserved communities, they are getting mentors, filmmakers, and they're putting them into the schools from fourth up all the way up to high school, and providing them with like, you know, the tools to make short films from like pre-production all the way to production, post-production, and by giving them the equipment to do it. And I think at least in the entertainment industry, that's important because a lot of people that are a part of that, if you don't even have, you know, if you've never seen a camera, if you've never had that idea of how to write a story, like why would you ever go into that field? And I think providing those opportunities since they're young is important for them also to, you know, say, oh, maybe I can do this. Why can't I be a writer? Why can't I be a director? Like, I think a lot of people, kids that are from, you know, communities that don't have access to it will never even think about becoming storytellers. So I think even from a young age, there are programs, and the studio should invest more in providing support to these kids when they're young, that this is something that they could also do. And I think, I mean, I've seen it with, because for LALIF, the Latino Film Festival, not during the pandemic, but before, they would bring these kids into the festival and they would show the films in the TCL. And it was just really amazing to see these kids that are, you know, 10 years old, 11 years old, standing up and talking about their projects and why this story was important for them. And I think that is a great way to show our community that they can also be part of this. And that also translates into them actually becoming better at math, better at English, you know, because it's that part of their confidence. So, so I think there are, I mean, there should be more, but there are programs that do this. And I do, like, from speaking to my colleagues and artists, there is that, you know, difficulty in breaking into the industry, that if you don't come from, a family or a different economic status, it's very, very difficult to break into. So I think we do have to do better at providing pathways for them.
And it's the same thing in the television industry as well. It's very, very hard to break through. There's so many people vying for reporter jobs. And one of the things I kept telling people was, listen, you don't have, look, if you love to write or produce, you can do things behind the scenes. You can be an online producer, you can be an editor, you can be a technical director, you can be a photographer, a videographer, as we say. You can be a managing editor in management. There are so many, you can still be in the profession you love. You don't have to, if you get sidelined trying to pursue one avenue, there's still so many opportunities available to you. And companies, to your point, Johanna, companies do need to create these unique hiring initiatives for Latinos, whether they're boot camps, and get them young, get them early, high school, because sometimes our population we don't necessarily make it to college, or maybe it's community college. You speak to them if it's not a 4-year institution, as we proudly all graduated from Boston University. Yes, go Terriers. But if that opportunity doesn't avail itself, then you need to make sure you get to them younger and earlier and sooner. So exposure is key. I've said that for a long time.
For sure. Yes, I agree. One question here from Carl, so kind of wrapping up. He says, it is devastating that we are still having the same conversation about the need to educate our clients and the general market media. Is there something we can be doing differently or better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate that question from Carl. And I relate to what he's saying. How is it possible that 30 years later, 25 years later, we're still fighting the same thing? And I want to provide my perspective, and I think we have made a ton of progress in the last decades, but obviously there is still work to be done, and there is still an untapped opportunity in the Latino audience and market. And I think is kind of cyclical, like a spiral, like you make progress and then you go a little bit back and then you continue, but it's always moving forward. I think that has been the trajectory, and I want to be optimistic that way. But it's the same way that nowadays our companies are very sophisticated at developing and taking into account the needs of every segment in the market, including Latinos, and providing a culturally relevant, not only messaging, but experience. And the same way that there are networks that are, ensuring representation and doing it right, there are a ton of others that are not. So those are the ones that we need to continue to educate as leaders in the industry. And I think that there is a lot to do, and a lot of organizations also providing measurement on the type of progress that has been made. Like as a panel, we reviewed the Latino Donor Collaborative Report, which they have been providing every several years, and that shows how still it is still under indexing the representation of Latino in media and in the different forms, broadcast, cable, streaming, and that's a reality that needs to change. But if it is not measured through data, and that data is shared, how can we increase awareness? So that those initiatives that provide visibility and measurement are key to really reach the top on every level in organizations, to continue to make progress in doing the right thing and ensuring the right representation for Latinos in the United States, not only in media, but in everything.
And listen, diversity and inclusion is the it phrase right now, right? So oftentimes it's, what exactly does that mean? Or how do I utilize that in my current workplace? So I think those are the things that a lot of companies are still grappling with. They have a sense of what that means and what they should be doing. But I mean, I truly believe that we're not going to have much change until we can get into some management positions. I really believe that is the core focus, because look, when you're a shot caller, you can decide who you bring on board and who you don't. And that's part of it. I mean, I tried for a very long time in television to elevate myself from being a field reporter to working in management. And I really hit a lot of barriers and obstacles. I didn't have the experience. I had never done it before. But let me tell you, a friend of mine he pushed harder than I did. He's Asian American, and he went from being a reporter in San Francisco, not a BU alum, sorry, but he became a managing editor. And let me tell you what he does now in Las Vegas as a managing editor. He makes sure that he hires AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander reporters and behind the scene talent. He pushes hard. He's the voice in the room that says, you must, they're qualified, they're not a token, and I want them on board. And oftentimes, until we can get to these C-suite, it shouldn't be the only answer, but it's one of many. And accountability, right? The National Association of Black Journalists, they have no problem whatsoever calling out organizations that don't promote or hire African Americans. They will issue press releases, press statements. They will go on a tangent. They will speak publicly about it on every news forum they can. And the National Association of Hispanic Journalists does it somewhat, but not as much. And until you can let the greater public know about the deficits that exist, we're not going to have any real effect or really impact, or we're not going to be able to impact change fully. So those are the things I think public awareness and getting people promoted to C-suite or management levels will help.
For sure. Yes. And it's one of those things where, like, in the meantime, while we get to those positions, we really do need, people who can vouch for us. And that's sort of those allies who can be like, I personally am going to enact this sort of change and will consciously do it. So it's something that sometimes people I think it's something to consciously strive for. Like, diversity and inclusion should not be something that we go like, oh, we just so happen to have the right amount of people to make a diverse news. No, I do think that is something that we need to actually consciously think about. Diverse people from diverse points of view bring so much to to any workplace. Like, think about like the news articles that can get written from having somebody who understands the culture, somebody who knows what they're talking about. The stories that we can see in TVs and movie shows of people who, more stories that are not about immigration or, crime and such, and beautiful stories about who we are. Think about the markets and the people that we can reach in an actual kind of emotional sense, by knowing people and hitting them where, they actually care about. So I echo everybody's voice. Like, yeah, we do need diversity and inclusion, and it's not something that we can just kind of find ourselves in there. Last question from Adriana. She says, in Puerto Rico, there was a significant decrease in the people that identify themselves as white and an increase in people that identify as Afro-descendant or Afro-Latino. Do you think this is a change in how Latinx people are seeing themselves? I think it is. I also think that the census, as someone who's actually filled it out, is completely complicated when you are a Latino. I think it's a million different things where you can be like, oh, I guess I am Black, and I guess I am all these other things.
I want to comment on that. That's a very good observation. And I think that was, for the first time, the census included a battery of questions that had that purpose, not only measuring race or ethnicity, but also additional questions that were more about identity. And that's why we saw those results, not only in Puerto Rico, but in the US as a whole, like the white segment decreasing and some of that shifting to other identities, not only Latino, but the other minorities as well. So that was definitely not only a product of people, maybe with all these, genetic testing, they also kind of know more about their origins too. So that may have had an impact, but also it's mostly the questions in the census that dug deeper into the identity. And I think that's the right approach. So I'm glad that it happened that way.
I think it's just that we're just having a social kind of reassessment of what our identities are. I think it's also, part of that, like, we are thinking of like where we come from because, these social movements are happening. And I think it's incredible and important that we kind of think about where we are and what we identify as. And again, just to go back to, I think we've been said a million times, Latinos are not just one kind of people. And these questions, I think, are incredible. I think is something that we should all sort of think of as we kind of go forward.
We're not a monolith.
We're definitely not a monolith, no, sir. So Jody, is that all? You good to go, or one more question?
Think we have time for maybe one more.
Cool. So I just wanted to, because with this panel, I am the only kind of man, and I wanted to just talk about that sense of like what it's like to be a woman, a Latino woman in the workplace, because you're fighting with like not just being Latino, you're also having problems that have to do with your who you are apart from that. So just quick thoughts on that.
I'll quickly just say that for the longest time when I worked as a reporter, I can sadly say that I was not living my life authentically as a Latina. Now, I mean, I was proud to be a Latina, never back down from that. But I'll be honest, I was all about keeping a job, right? And so you don't work 25 years in a business unless you just kind of go along to get along. And the pronunciation of my last name, I would try to Americanize it. It would be, Vasquez, and I would have to tell the anchors, Yolanda, how do you say your name? I don't know how to say your Yolanda Vasquez. If Yolanda Vasquez will be just fine. I blonded up my hair. I wanted to naturally wear colors that pop. Not allowed. Big hoop earrings, right? Couldn't do it. I had to small myself, as I say, and be very diminutive, just to be able to kind of not be seen. Now that I think of it, and all I can say is, these days, be proud to say your name the way it should be said. Wear the clothes you want to wear, as bright as they need to be, and embrace the true you fully. Because I didn't do it for almost 25 years, and now I am.
Great. I remember I asked a top executive, female executive, how did you do it? What is the secret of your success? And she was like, why? From my perspective, well, you're a woman, so how did you get where you are? And she said, I don't even think about it. I don't even think about being female. And that was an epiphany for me. And I said, that's it. I mean, we have to get rid of those limitations are sometimes self-imposed and just be who we are and work hard, focus on our talents or what we want to achieve and just go for it. I mean, and don't spend 1 second on thinking that you are different or they perceive you this way or the other. I think that we may waste too much time doing that. Not helpful.
I mean, in my case, I think I've been fortunate because I really haven't felt that I had to struggle more being Latina or being a woman. I think it also has to do with, I've been very lucky to work with a lot of women as my mentors, very strong women that are just really strong women and they speak their mind and really being a woman has never something that stopped them from doing something. So, but I think that's also, I've been lucky and privileged in that way. But I agree with my colleagues that that you just have to go for it and be proud of who you are. And if, not everybody has to like you. We sometimes want to please and we don't necessarily have to do that,
Mm-hmm.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. So yes. So I think that wraps up today's conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the panelists. Thank you so much for the attendance. And thank you so much for everybody who made this possible. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for everybody here. And goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ephraim.
so
Thank you.
much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.